Dr. Amit Goswami is a theoretical nuclear physicist. He taught physics at the University of Oregon for 32 years and is on the advisory board of the Institute of Noetic Sciences. He was interviewed in the hit movie What the Bleep Do We Know? And was featured in another movie, Dalai Lama Renaissance. Dr. Goswami is the author of many popular books on quantum physics. He recently talked at East West Books in Mountain View about his latest book, God is Not Dead. And afterward, he agreed to give me a private interview in which he talked about monistic idealism, in which consciousness, not matter, is the ground of all being and the basis of the major religions. Dr. Goswami, many people today have a naive interpretation of God. They conceive of God as being an emperor on a throne in the sky, and then set up that straw God and then refute it. So how has your work dealt with this problem?
This is a general problem about bringing the new scientific view in the forefront of popular opinion. The problem is that this God has been discarded by generally philosophers and scientists alike, most educated people, at least a century ago. So this is really not the issue anymore. Unfortunately, by the advent of scientific materialism, which is the idea that everything is made of matter, that some scientists are pushing very hard since 1950s, religions have been pushed to a corner. Fundamentalists have grown in not only America, but in other countries as well. Some of the effects we are seeing in the form of terrorism as extreme as that. But when this happens, very primitive pictures of God come back to the forefront. So the more materialism pushes on these people to give up their belief system and accept one which is selfish and negative and hedonistic, the more these people tend to believe in a God which is very simplistic of the olden days, forgetting some of the reasons that we have to give up on such a God. So, is God like that? No. The God that science is rediscovering for the past couple of decades is very different. It has to be compatible with science, of course. So it is a very scientific God, but at the same time does retain the most important part of all spiritual traditions. In fact, these people that I just called fearful and fundamentalist because they are being pushed, if you put a God that satisfies the three criterions I'll now mention, even they will basically be satisfied. They may not be satisfied with the details, but everyone who is spiritually minded, religious minded, supports these three notions connected with God and spirituality. The first is, apart from material causation, there is another source of causality in the world. This is the source that is called God. Material causation is called upward causation because cause rises from elementary particles upward to atoms, to molecules, to cells, to brain. This new source of causation, new old, because this is also very old, in the religious traditions, spiritual traditions are given various names, but I will use the phrase downward causation for it to nicely contrast it from upward causation.
Before you do, could you tell us what upward causation is?
Upward causation is that idea that cause rises upward from elementary particles to more and more complex conglomerates of elementary particles.
So from elements to atoms?
Elementary particles to atoms, to molecules, to cells, to brain eventually.
Then to consciousness.
And then consciousness is just a brain phenomenon.
An epiphenomenon of
Epiphenomenon of the brain.
Right.
It has no causal efficacy apart from the causal efficacy of the elementary particles and their interactions.
Right.
So that becomes the basis of scientific materialism. And spiritual traditions say that no, there is another source of causality, another source of causal power, and this source is what they call God, basically.
And this is in sync with the perennial philosophy.
This is in sync with the perennial philosophy as well, and this is also in sync with what science is rediscovering. We are finding that without downward causation, we cannot explain many, many scientific paradoxes and anomalies.
So if we can put it this way, where does downward causation originate?
Downward causation in the new view originates from a higher state of our own consciousness, a non-ordinary state of our own consciousness. And here is where quantum physics plays a very major role. How does downward causation, how is it exerted? Quantum physics says that material objects are possibilities. They are not determined things that Newton thought they were. They are actually possibilities. Now these possibilities, it is a fact that these possibilities, whenever we look at them, they become actual things of our experience. A little more sophisticated way of putting this is that quantum physics predicts waves of possibility, but whenever we look, they look like particle in our experience. So how does the wave become a particle? This becomes a paradox in the materialist way of thinking, because in material way of thinking, possible elementary particles making possible atoms, making possible molecules, making possible cells, making possible brain, making possible consciousness, and this possible consciousness looking at possible particles, possible objects, possible elementary particles, cannot possibly give you any actuality, right? So actuality becomes impossible in this way of looking at things. How does actuality arrive then? So the idea is that it is the looking by a non-material consciousness that is converting possibility into actuality. Consciousness have to be non-material. We must have a non-material component within us. We have a material body, no doubt, but there must also be a non-material consciousness. Unfortunately, scientists see a paradox in that also, and scientists are right. The paradox is the kind of thinking that we are now doing is again dualism, very close to how Descartes posited the mind and matter dualism. And ever since Descartes, we have known that this is a major weakness of that view, which is that how does a non-material mind, non-material consciousness interact with matter? They have nothing in common, so they need a mediator to interact. But any mediator will have to use a signal containing energy. So energy has to go out of the material world into another world, or energy has to come back from another world to material world. But any of these effects are never seen. The energy of the material world itself is always a constant in any process. It never goes out of material world, never comes into the material world from any other world. So this law of energy conservation is violated in any kind of dualistic thinking, and this is why dualistic thinking is not scientific. So this was a major problem of accepting this consciousness solution of how quantum possibilities are converted to actual events of experience, which was first proposed by John von Neumann, a great scientist.
What is some of the most striking evidence for downward causation?
The most striking evidence for downward causation comes from the quantum signatures of downward causation. Downward causation comes with such signatures that they can never be forged by material interaction. Well, let me give you an example. Downward causation is non-local, does not require signals for communication. And non-locality is something that material interaction can never simulate. Therefore, if I find evidence for non-locality in our dealings with each other, then materialist science can never refute downward causation again, because there is no materialist way of understanding this phenomenon. And this is why materialists tooth and nail fight the ideas that they label as parapsychology, because parapsychologists are people who try to find evidence for non-local communications among those that are labeled as psychics. Now, many work involving psychics have been done, and of course scientists try to refute these works because they involve thoughts, and we can never be sure of thoughts thoughts are not materially measurable in certain sense. So this aspect of parapsychology is bogged down into controversy. But there are, however, experiments that started with Jacobo Greenberg at the University of Mexico, who read my work about consciousness is the ground of being, and read the conclusion that the conscious choice takes place at a deep level where we are one. There is a fundamental non-locality of our consciousness at a deeper level. When he saw that, he theorized that there should be a way of verifying this idea that consciousness is non-local. We share consciousness with others. He asked two people to meditate together, and these people are not psychics, so you cannot label them. They're just ordinary people. They meditate together for 20 minutes with the idea that they will have direct communication, non-local signal-less communication. After meditating for 20 minutes, they are told to hold the intention of non-local communication, but they are separated and put in independent Faraday chambers. These are electromagnetically impervious chambers. No electromagnetic wave can go through them. So there is no electromagnetic connection anymore between these two observers. Basically, any signal connection has been eliminated this way. So now their brains individually are connected to individual electroencephalogram EEG machines. And now one subject and one subject only is shown a series of light flashes. This subject brain becomes active in the occipital area, and that is what is then measured by the EEG connected to this brain. From the EEG recordings, the noise can be eliminated and the signal is extracted. That signal is called an evoked potential. Now, one also looks at the brain waves recorded by the EEG machine connected to the second subject's brain, who has not seen any light flashes. And when one eliminates noise from this recording of the EEG of the second subject, the astounding thing is that the signal one gets is so close in strength and phase with the first signal, with the evoked potential, that the researchers were forced to say that this is a transferred potential. In other words, electric potential has been transferred from one brain to another without any electrical connection. How is that possible? This is not ordinary telepathy. This is not just a transfer of thought, and therefore you can always create controversies about talking about thoughts. This is actual electric potential transferred from one brain to another, but without any electrical connection. Because control subjects who don't meditate together or who cannot hold the intention, for them there is no transfer potential. That has been checked out. There is no transfer potential. So something special happens when you meditate together with the intention that you will become one. You will become non-locally connected. Are you non-locally connected? Yes, you are, because your brain is picking up electric potential from another brain with whom you have been connected, although you are not seeing the light flashes. But consciousness chooses out of the possibilities in your brain that particular state which corresponds to looking at light flashes anyway. And this is because you are connected in consciousness with your correlated partner. So this is one of the major evidence. And this is an evidence that supports non-locality, cannot be simulated by material interactions. So very good evidence for downward causation, which is here to stay. This experiment of Jacobo Greenberg at the University of Mexico has now been replicated at the University of, in London by Peter Fenwick and his collaborators, by a researcher named Wackerman, and then finally at 2004 in Bastille University by Liana Standish and her collaborators. All 4 experiments, independent experiments, 4 different research groups, 4 different laboratories, replicating the same basic data.